For role-playing junkies, the wait is almost over. At long last, Konami is about to release the RPG compilation that fans have been begging for. I'm talking about Suikoden 1 and 2 HD Remaster, Gate Rune, and Dunan Unification Wars. While that title may be a little clunky, the important news is that both Suikoden and its sequel Suikoden II will finally be playable on modern consoles. Yeah, that's cool news. But are either of these games actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, Computer and Video Games, and more classic magazines that reviewed both of these games when they were first released. Oh, I sure hope you like collecting heroes, because this is a very turn-based episode of Suikoden Review Crew.
PlayStation よ。これが RPG だ。幻想水湖伝 From Konami.
These days, when we look back at the PlayStation, we see it as a bastion of important role-playing games that would once and for all bring the genre into the mainstream. But it wasn't always like that. If you were a big fan of Japanese RPGs, then those first couple of years were kinda rough. Thankfully, Suikoden came out at just the right time, bridging the divide between forgettable titles like Beyond the Beyond and seminal titles like Final Fantasy VII. Created by the fresh-faced Yoshitaka Murayama and based on the classical Chinese novel Water Margin, Suikoden offered an epic story with more than 100 protagonists, massive large-scale battles, and sprite-based graphics that were all things that helped the game stand apart from other RPGs of the era. This ended up being the perfect game to tide role-playing game fans over until Square brought Final Fantasy VII to the West, with some gamers going as far as to argue that Suikoden is actually a superior adventure. But what did the critics say? Were they as high on this game as the fans were? Well, as is so often the case, the answer depends entirely on what magazine you subscribed to at the time. Let's go ahead and start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, who gave the original Suikoden an average score of 8.75 out of 10. Sean praised the game's length, calling it almost mind-boggling. I have to admit that I was pretty intimidated as I was playing through and realizing what I was taking on. There's a huge amount of different characters in the game, and the development and involvement of them in the story is awesome. I really enjoyed being able to battle monsters or enemies in different ways. The army versus army battles reminded me of Dragon Force on the Saturn in a way, which is a great thing. This one is for those with a lot of time and patience. Crispin agreed, arguing that until Square releases Final Fantasy VII later this year, Suikoden will reign as the PlayStation's finest RPG. The storyline is truly epic and well conveyed through high-quality dialogue and sharp graphics, while a superbly orchestrated soundtrack sets the game's tone. Unlike other RPGs, you can build a party of more than 100 characters. The combat system is outstanding, letting you engage in the traditional party versus monster battle or the more ambitious army versus army wars. For what it's worth, EGM's average sits right in the middle of the scale. When we look at the lower scores, we see Next Generation going with a straight 4 out of 5, while its sister magazine Edge couldn't muster up anything higher than a 7 out of 10. That said, the absolute lowest score comes from Computer and Video Games, who gave it a 3 out of 5 in their 182nd issue. I doubt most players looking for their first RPG will be disappointed with Suikoden. It's everything you expect to find, and still more besides. The narrative carries a fairly melancholy tone more often than not, which keeps your heart in the story while your head is required for thinking problems through. I have a problem with the fact that none of the furniture found inside of most buildings offers any treasure, as it makes a lot of locations redundant. It's so annoying to keep wandering into empty rooms. And for the average games player, this style of RPG might seem little different from the 16-bit examples that they've been avoiding. Fans of this scene will have no problem acknowledging a skilled tale, beautiful music, and involving fight action. On the complete other side of the scale, we see GamePro rave about Suikoden, giving it an almost perfect 4.5 out of 5. The recently rebranded Ultra Game players also loved the game, going all the way up to a 9.1 out of 10. However, no magazine loved this RPG more than GameFan, who had also just recently gone through a rebranding. Dakui explained that Suikoden is one of the few fantasy RPGs that truly takes the genre in a whole new direction. There are some potholes along the road, like the equipping and unequipping problem and such. The storyline is great, the battle system is very well done, and the characters are vivid and memorable. And the soundtrack is just stunning. Yeah, the overhead graphics kinda bite, but otherwise this is a truly spectacular experience. And then there's Orion, who makes the case that this is the PlayStation's first great RPG. Nothing hurts me more than my entire PlayStation RPG selection consisting of the very bad Beyond the Beyond. Thanks to Konami, that's all changing with the domestic release of Suikoden. Now this should have been the first PlayStation RPG release. It has an outstanding storyline, great battles, and amazing music, making Suikoden the best 32-bit RPG I've ever played. I can't thank you enough, Konami. GameFan gave the game an average score of 94%. Look, even though there were a couple of high-profile detractors, most critics agreed that Suikoden was the first must-own RPG on the PlayStation. And I agree, this is definitely a strong start to a very strong series. Let's see if that good luck continues with the sequel, Suikoden II. Oh, what a difference a few years makes! When the first Suikoden was released, it was seen as the first truly great role-playing game on Sony's fledgling PlayStation. Now, 3 years later, things are a lot different. Thanks in large part to the overwhelming success of Final Fantasy VII, suddenly role-playing games are all the rage. This allowed Konami to deliver a bigger and more ambitious Suikoden sequel that not only looked better, but it also helped to fill in a lot of the lore surrounding the series. Once again, the fans loved it, but as you'll see, that did not necessarily translate to high scores from the critics. You might think that the sudden interest in role-playing games would actually help Suikoden II get more coverage, but the exact opposite happened. For example, Electronic Gaming Monthly went from having 4 critics enthusiastically review the original to only one unnamed critic begrudgingly covering the sequel. Giving it a 7 out of 10, they concluded that if you have the time and you're willing to commit to at least 50 hours, Suikoden II is an RPG that'll keep your attention. It heralds 108 characters, including some old favorites like Flick and Victor. The storyline is compelling and features the adult themes of betrayal, death, and tomfoolery. If you had the foresight to save your memory card from the first Suikoden, you can download those into this lengthy thrill ride. Annoyingly, the main character cannot move sideways, but otherwise is a real hoot. If you've got the time, it's worth the ride. Now, if you're a big fan of Suikoden 2, then you might be surprised to see EGM go that low. However, they weren't alone, as PlayStation Power gave the RPG a score of 7 out of 10, which is basically tied with the 71% that we saw from GameFan in their 74th issue. Of course, that's nothing compared to GamePro, who went from giving the original a score of 4.5 out of 5, all the way down to giving the sequel a mere 2.5 out of 5. That's easily the lowest magazine score that I could find. Graphically, Suikoden 2 looks better than the original, with detailed environments and explorable areas. But you'll find that it's all a waste of time with too much to explore and nothing to gain. Unfortunately, the sound is pretty bland. There's virtually no voiceovers, and the background music shines only during combat. The spell effects actually sound better than the tunes. Even fans of the original Suikoden will have a hard time enjoying the sequel, given that there's nothing new here. you probably won't want to invest the time or the trouble it would take to embark on this pointless quest. While GamePro and other magazines were busy flip-flopping their scores, it was actually Next Generation who ended up being the most consistent. When they reviewed the original Suikoden, they gave it a 4 out of 5. The exact same score they gave the sequel. At its heart, Suikoden II portrays a deeply involving struggle between two best friends embroiled in all sorts of political and emotional conflicts. Quietly epic in scope, but with moments of casual pace. This won't dazzle gamers with massive spells and a multitude of love triangles, but remains impressive and earns its place as a must-have RPG. One of the best role-playing games to hit the PlayStation this year. Now, as we climb up the scale, we see PSM give the Suikoden sequel an impressive score of 4.5 out of 5. However, the most shocking revelation comes from none other than Computer and Video Games, who went from giving the first game the lowest score to giving the sequel a perfect 5 out of 5. Whew, talk about a turnaround. Though it doesn't have the visual flair of Final Fantasy VII, Suikoden II is more instantly playable, immediately rewarding, and a lot more fun. The action may feel lightweight at first, but that's the game's clever way of breaking you into this amazing journey that'll last you weeks. One of the most satisfying and emotionally effective old-school RPGs you'll ever play. This is one of those rare sequels where the critics are all over the place. The magazines that were disappointed by the first game ended up loving the follow-up, and vice versa. It's exciting to see that Suikoden 2 will be included in the upcoming collection, allowing gamers to finally decide for themselves if it holds up or not. Check it out!
Rune を描かないゲームに本当の感動はない。この冬、すべてのロールプレイングゲームを超えて、幻想水湖伝2、12月17日発売。
Konami.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post episodes just like this whenever classic games get added to modern consoles. We have a whole playlist with hundreds of these reviews, so give it a binge watch when you have a couple of minutes to spare. Now, here's the question I have for you. Will you be picking up Suikoden 1 and 2 HD Remaster? Let me know in the comments below. In other news, we're going to be back next week with more stuff. More reviews, more review crews, maybe an EGM ranks, who knows? While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.